The gunshot that killed Vernon Bailey on a scorching July afternoon in 1878 left his wife Violet standing in the dusty street of Raton, New Mexico territory, with blood on her hands and murder in the eyes of the man who fired the weapon. She had thrown herself over her husband's body, trying to shield him from the second bullet, but the shooter had already disappeared into the crowd of miners and ranch hands that filled the street during the shift change at the nearby coal mine. Violet was 24 years old, and in the span of 3 minutes, her entire world collapsed into a nightmare of shouting voices, rough hands pulling her away from Vernon's still form, and the metallic taste of dust and grief in her mouth. Someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders even though the temperature hovered near 90 degrees. The sheriff, an older man named Hobbs with kind eyes and a tobacco-stained mustache, knelt beside her on the boardwalk where they had moved her. "Mrs. Bailey, I need you to tell me what you saw," he said gently, his hand on her shoulder steady and warm, but Violet could only shake her head. The shooting had happened so fast. One moment Vernon had been laughing, telling her about a mare he planned to break that evening, his strong hand clasped around hers as they walked from the general store toward home. The next moment, that terrible crack of gunfire split the air, and Vernon's hand had gone slack in hers as he crumpled to the ground. The town buried Vernon Bailey 3 days later in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Raton, where the wind swept down from the mountains and carried the scent of pine and sage. Violet stood at the graveside in her black dress, borrowed from the minister's wife because she had owned nothing suitable for mourning. Her own mother had died when she was 16, and her father had passed 2 years after that, leaving her alone until Vernon had come into her life like a summer storm, full of energy and laughter and plans for the future. Now she was alone again, more alone than she had ever been, because she had known what it was to be loved completely, and had felt that love ripped away. The weeks after the funeral blurred together in a haze of grief and practicality. Violet had to sort through Vernon's possessions, settle his debts, and figure out how she would survive. They had been married for 3 years, and in that time, they had saved enough to buy a small parcel of land east of town where they had been building a house. The structure stood half-finished now, a skeleton of timber and stone that mocked her with its unfinished rooms and empty windows. She sold the land and the partial house to a rancher from Colorado for less than it was worth, but she needed the money quickly. The sale gave her enough to rent a small house in town and purchase supplies to start a dressmaking business. Violet had always been skilled with a needle, and the women of Raton needed dresses, alterations, and mending. It was honest work, and it kept her hands busy during the long days when grief threatened to overwhelm her. The sheriff never found Vernon's killer. The investigation went cold after a few weeks, though Sheriff Hobbs assured Violet that he would never stop looking. She appreciated his kindness, but she knew the truth. In a territory as wild and lawless as New Mexico, where men came and went like tumbleweeds and violence erupted as suddenly as thunderstorms, justice was often an elusive thing. Violet Bailey, now a widow at 24, settled into a new pattern of life. She woke early, worked until her fingers ached, attended church on Sundays, and spoke politely to her neighbors. She did not smile often, and she did not encourage the attention of men, though several tried to court her in those first months of widowhood. She turned them all away with firm politeness, making it clear that she had no interest in remarrying. "It is too soon," she told Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, when that good woman suggested that Violet might consider accepting the attentions of the banker's son. "I am not ready to think of such things." But the truth, though Violet did not speak it aloud, was that she could not imagine loving anyone the way she had loved Vernon. The thought of another man's hands on her waist, another man's voice in her ear, felt like a betrayal of everything she and Vernon had shared. She had loved him with the fierce, complete love of youth, and his death had left a hole in her heart that she believed would never heal. So she focused on her work and her survival, and the months passed, and autumn came to Raton with its golden aspens and cold winds, and then winter buried the town under snow. It was during a February snowstorm, 18 months after Vernon's death, that Violet first really noticed Xander Quinn. She had seen him around town before, of course. Everyone in Raton knew everyone else, at least by sight. Xander was a cowboy who worked for the Three Rivers Ranch, a sprawling operation that ran cattle across thousands of acres north of town. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that seemed to notice everything without seeming to stare. Violet had spoken to him briefly a few times in passing, exchanged pleasantries in the general store or on the street, but she had never paid him much attention. He was just another cowboy in a town full of them, distinguished only by his quiet manner, and the way he always tipped his hat to her with a slight smile that never quite reached his eyes. On this particular February day, Violet had been walking home from delivering a finished dress to a customer when the storm hit suddenly, as winter storms often did in the mountains. The wind picked up with shocking violence, driving snow horizontally across the street and reducing visibility to nearly nothing. Violet pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to hurry, but the wind pushed against her like a living thing, and the cold cut through her clothes with vicious intensity. She was struggling against the wind, her eyes watering from the cold when a figure materialized out of the swirling snow beside her. Strong hands gripped her arms, steadying her, and Xander Quinn's face appeared close to hers, his expression concerned. "Mrs. Bailey, you should not be out in this," he shouted over the wind. "Let me help you home." Before she could protest, he had wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders over her shawl and taken her arm firmly in his. Together they pushed through the storm, Xander's solid presence beside her a bulwark against the wind. He guided her unerringly through the white chaos, and within minutes, they reached her small house on the edge of town. Violet fumbled with frozen fingers at her door, and Xander gently moved her aside and opened it himself, ushering her into the relative warmth of her front room. She stood shivering while he quickly built up the fire in her stove, his movements efficient and practiced. When flames were crackling cheerfully in the firebox, he turned to her with that same slight smile. "You should warm up before you catch your death," he said. "Would it be improper for me to make you some coffee, Mrs. Bailey?" Violet wanted to say that it would indeed be improper, that he should leave immediately, but she was so cold and so grateful for his help that instead she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn. That would be kind." He made coffee with the ease of a man accustomed to doing for himself, and when he handed her a steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly. Violet felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, something that might have been awareness or interest, and immediately she felt guilty. She took the cup and stepped back, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. "I appreciate your help," she said formally. "It was fortunate that you were nearby." "I saw you heading out when the storm clouds were gathering," Xander said quietly. "I thought I should keep an eye out in case you needed assistance getting home." Something about his words made Violet look at him more closely. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something gentle and patient in his gray eyes. He was not much older than she was, perhaps 28 or 29, and his face had the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. There was a scar along his jaw, a thin white line that disappeared into the stubble on his cheek. "That was thoughtful of you," Violet said after a moment, "but surely you must return to the ranch before the storm gets worse." "I am staying in town tonight," Xander said. "The foreman gave several of us leave until the weather clears. I have a room at the boarding house." An awkward silence fell between them. Violet sipped her coffee and tried to think of something to say, but her mind felt strangely blank. Finally, Xander set down his own cup and moved toward the door. "I should leave you to warm up properly," he said. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Bailey." After he left, Violet stood in her small front room for a long time, staring at the door and trying to understand the strange feeling in her chest. It was not attraction, she told herself firmly. It was simply gratitude for his kindness and relief at being out of the storm. Nothing more. But over the following weeks, she found herself noticing Xander Quinn more often. He seemed to be in town more frequently than before, and whenever she saw him, he would tip his hat to her and exchange a few words if circumstances permitted. He never pressed for more than she was willing to give, never overstepped the bounds of propriety, but there was something in his manner that suggested he was aware of her in a way that went beyond casual acquaintance. Spring came late that year, with snow lingering into April and frost threatening the early garden plants. Violet's dressmaking business had grown steadily, and she found herself with more work than she could handle comfortably. She had hired a young woman named Sarah to help with the simpler tasks, and the two of them worked together in companionable silence most days, their needles flashing in the lamplight as they turned fabric into garments. It was Sarah who first mentioned Xander Quinn's interest to Violet directly. "That cowboy from Three Rivers Ranch is sweet on you," Sarah said one afternoon in May, glancing up from the hem she was stitching. "Everyone in town can see it." Violet felt her cheeks grow warm. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Quinn," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "He is always finding excuses to be in town on your path, always tipping his hat and asking after you. Mrs. Henderson says he asked the minister about you last Sunday, wanted to know if you were doing well." "That is simply kindness," Violet said firmly, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "Mr. Quinn is a polite man, nothing more." But Sarah's words stayed with Violet, and she found herself watching for Xander when she went about her errands. Sure enough, he did seem to be in town more often, and he always made a point of speaking to her if he could do so without being obvious. Their conversations remained brief and proper, but Violet began to sense a depth of feeling beneath Xander's quiet exterior that both frightened and intrigued her. Summer arrived with its heat and dust, and Violet marked the second anniversary of Vernon's death with a visit to the cemetery. She knelt by his grave and placed wildflowers on the stone, and she spoke to him silently, telling him about her life and her struggles and her loneliness. When she rose to leave, she found Xander Quinn standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, waiting. "Forgive me for intruding, Mrs. Bailey," he said quietly. "I did not mean to disturb your privacy." Violet brushed dust from her skirt and tried to compose herself. Her eyes were damp with tears and she felt raw and vulnerable. "You are not intruding, Mr. Quinn. Were you visiting someone?" "My mother," Xander said, gesturing to a grave several rows away. "She passed 5 years ago. My father brought her out here from Missouri and she never quite took to the territory. The harshness of it wore on her." "I am sorry for your loss," Violet said. They walked down the hill together in silence, and when they reached the edge of town, Xander paused. He looked at Violet with an expression so open and earnest that it took her breath away. "Mrs. Bailey, I know it has only been 2 years since you lost your husband," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "And I know you are not looking for a new husband." But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever feel ready to consider such a thing, I would be honored if you would allow me to court you properly." Violet felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She stared at Xander, seeing the hope and nervousness in his eyes, and she wanted to say yes. Part of her, a part she had tried to ignore and deny, wanted very much to say yes. But the larger part of her, the part that still belonged to Vernon, recoiled from the idea. "Mr. Quinn," she began, and then stopped, unsure how to continue. "You do not need to answer now," Xander said quickly. "I am not asking for an answer. I just wanted you to know how I feel so that when you are ready, if you ever are ready, you will know that I am here." With that, he tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Violet standing in the dusty street with her heart pounding and her mind in turmoil. That night, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom and thinking about Xander's words. She thought about Vernon and the love they had shared, and she thought about the empty years stretching ahead of her if she remained alone. She thought about Xander's quiet strength and patient kindness, and she wondered if it was possible to love again after losing someone as she had lost Vernon. But she was not ready. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The next time she saw Xander in town, she greeted him politely but distantly, and he accepted her coolness without comment. He continued to tip his hat to her when they passed on the street, but he made no further mention of his feelings or his hopes. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter again. Violet's business continued to thrive, and she hired another woman to help with the increased workload. She had enough money now to live comfortably, though not extravagantly, and she began to save toward purchasing a small house rather than continuing to rent. Xander Quinn remained a constant, quiet presence in her life. He was always polite, always respectful, and he never pressed her for more than she was willing to give. But Violet could feel his attention on her like sunlight on her skin, warm and steady and patient. It should have annoyed her, this persistent interest, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. In a world that often felt uncertain and dangerous, Xander's constancy was like a rock she could lean against if she chose. But she did not choose. Not yet. 3 years after Vernon's death, in July of 1881, Violet traveled to Santa Fe for a week to purchase fabrics and supplies for her business. Sarah and the other assistant could manage the shop in her absence, and Violet welcomed the change of scenery. Santa Fe was larger and more sophisticated than Raton, with better shops and more variety in goods. She had been in the city for 3 days when she encountered a man who introduced himself as Charles Morrison. He was a merchant from St. Louis, in Santa Fe on business, and he was charming and well-dressed and attentive. He asked if he might buy her dinner, and Violet, feeling reckless and lonely and tired of her own grief, agreed. Dinner with Charles Morrison was pleasant. He was witty and cultured, and he made Violet laugh for the first time in months. When he suggested they meet again the following evening, she agreed to that as well. For 3 evenings, she dined with Charles, and he was the perfect gentleman, never overstepping, never assuming too much. On her last evening in Santa Fe, Charles walked her back to her hotel and asked if he might write to her. He would be traveling back to St. Louis in a few days, he said, but he would very much like to continue their acquaintance by letter. Violet hesitated, then agreed. It was only letters, after all. Where was the harm? When she returned to Raton, she found the town buzzing with news. There had been a shooting at one of the saloons, and a drifter had been killed. The dead man had been carrying a watch that the sheriff recognized as belonging to Vernon Bailey. When confronted, the drifter had confessed, in his dying moments, to killing Vernon 3 years earlier over a gambling debt that Vernon had known nothing about. The killer had mistaken Vernon for someone else, Violet listened to this news with a strange sense of detachment. After 3 years, the identity of Vernon's killer seemed almost irrelevant. The man was dead now, and Vernon was still dead, and justice, such as it was, had been served. But the knowledge that Vernon's death had been a case of mistaken identity, a senseless act of violence based on a misunderstanding, made it somehow worse. He had died for nothing, killed by a stranger's error. That night, Violet wept harder than she had since the funeral. She grieved not just for Vernon, but for the waste of it all, the terrible randomness of violence and death. And when her tears finally stopped, she felt something shift inside her. The tight knot of grief that had lived in her chest for 3 years began, very slowly, to loosen. The letters from Charles Morrison arrived weekly for the next 2 months. They were entertaining and affectionate, full of news about his business and questions about her life. Violet answered them politely, but she found herself struggling to muster much enthusiasm for the correspondence. Charles was kind and interesting, but something about the relationship felt hollow, as if they were both playing roles rather than truly connecting. In September, Charles wrote to say that he would be returning to Santa Fe on business in October and hoped very much to see her again. Violet read the letter twice, trying to decide how she felt about this news, and realized that she felt nothing. No excitement, no anticipation, nothing. That same week, she was walking home from the post office when she encountered Xander Quinn leading his horse down the main street. His face lit up when he saw her, and he crossed the street to greet her. "Mrs. Bailey," he said, tipping his hat. "It is good to see you. I heard you traveled to Santa Fe last month. I hope the trip was successful." "It was," Violet said, and found herself smiling at him. "I found some beautiful fabrics for the winter season." They stood in the afternoon sunlight, talking about nothing in particular, and Violet realized with a start that this simple conversation with this patient, steadfast man felt more real and more right than all her evenings with Charles Morrison had felt. She looked at Xander's weathered face and kind eyes, and she felt something in her heart crack open. "Mr. Quinn," she said slowly, interrupting his story about a difficult calf birthing at the ranch, "you once said that if I ever felt ready to consider courtship, you would like to know." Xander went very still. His gray eyes searched her face, and she saw hope flare in them, quickly tempered by caution. "I did say that, yes. I am not ready yet," Violet said, and saw his face fall slightly. "But I think I might be someday, and when that day comes, I would like it to be you." It was not much, but it was more than she had given him in 3 years, and Xander's face transformed with joy. He did not reach for her or try to embrace her, but his smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I will wait," he said simply. "However long it takes, I will wait." That conversation marked a turning point for Violet. She began to allow Xander into her life in small ways. When he asked if he might walk her home from church, she agreed. When he offered to repair the loose step on her front porch, she accepted. They took walks together on Sunday afternoons, always properly chaperoned by the presence of other townspeople, and they talked about everything and nothing. Violet learned that Xander had come to New Mexico from Kansas when he was 18, looking for work and adventure. He had spent 10 years working various ranches, learning the cattle business from the ground up, and he had ambitions of someday owning his own spread. He was steady and hardworking, honest to a fault, and he possessed a dry sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly and never failed to make Violet laugh. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Missouri, about losing her parents and feeling adrift until Vernon had come into her life. She told him about her grief and her loneliness, and about how she had thought she would never want to love anyone again. Xander listened to all of it with patient attention, never judging, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. The letters from Charles Morrison continued to arrive, and Violet finally wrote back to tell him, gently but firmly, that she did not wish to continue their correspondence. Charles wrote one final letter expressing his disappointment but wishing her well, and that chapter of her life closed quietly. Winter came again, the fourth winter since Vernon's death. Violet was 28 now, and she felt both older and younger than her years. Older because grief had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Younger because the possibility of new love had awakened something in her that she had thought was dead. On Christmas Eve, Xander asked if he might call on her at her home. Violet agreed, and that evening he arrived with a small wrapped package. They sat in her front room, the stove radiating warmth, and Xander handed her the gift with an almost shy expression. "I made this for you," he said. "I hope it is not too presumptuous." Violet unwrapped the package to find a wooden box, beautifully crafted from smooth pine and inlaid with a design of flowers. The workmanship was exquisite, every joint perfectly fitted, every surface sanded smooth as silk. She ran her fingers over it reverently. "Xander, this is beautiful," she whispered. "You made this." "I used to do some woodworking when I was younger," he said. "I thought you might use it for your sewing supplies or anything else you like." Violet looked up at him, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He was looking at her with such open love and longing that she felt her defenses crumble. For the first time since Vernon's death, she allowed herself to truly see Xander, not as a persistent suitor or a patient friend, but as a man she could love. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will treasure it." That winter passed more quickly than any season since Vernon's death. Violet saw Xander as often as propriety allowed, and their friendship deepened into something richer and more complex. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, wondering what he was doing, imagining conversations they might have. When he smiled at her, she felt warmth spread through her chest. When his hand brushed hers accidentally, she felt a flutter of awareness that was both exciting and terrifying. But still, she was not ready to say yes. Something held her back, some final thread of loyalty to Vernon that she could not quite sever. She knew she was being unfair to Xander, keeping him waiting without any certainty that she would ever truly be ready, but he never complained. He simply continued to wait, as patient and steady as the mountains that surrounded Raton. Spring arrived early in 1882, and with it came a period of unseasonably warm weather. The snows melted rapidly, and the streams and rivers swelled with runoff. One afternoon in late March, Violet was working in her shop when Sarah rushed in, her face pale with fear. "The river is flooding," she gasped. "The Cimarron has overflowed its banks and the water is coming into town. They are evacuating the lower streets." Violet's house was on one of the lower streets. She abandoned her sewing immediately and ran through the muddy streets toward home, her heart pounding with fear. She had to save her possessions, her money, her livelihood. But when she reached her street, she found it already under several inches of water, with the level rising visibly. She waded into the water, gasping at the cold, and pushed toward her house. She had almost reached her front door when she heard someone shouting her name. She turned to see Xander riding toward her on his horse, the animal's legs churning through the rising water. "Violet, get out of there," he shouted, using her first name for the first time ever. "The water is rising too fast. It is not safe." "I have to get my things," she called back, but even as she spoke, she felt the current strengthen around her legs, threatening to knock her off her feet. Xander rode his horse right up beside her and reached down, his arm extended. "Take my hand. Now." Something in his voice, urgent and commanding, made her obey without thinking. She grasped his hand, and he pulled her up behind him on the horse with surprising strength. His arm came around her waist, holding her securely against him, and he turned the horse and urged it through the water toward higher ground. Violet clung to Xander, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. She could feel the solid strength of him, smell the scent of leather and soap and something indefinably him. Her heart was racing, but not just from fear of the flood. Being held against him like this, feeling his arm tight around her, awakened feelings she had tried to suppress for so long. When they reached dry ground, Xander dismounted and helped her down, his hands on her waist steadying her. For a moment they stood very close, both breathing hard, and Violet looked up into his face and saw naked concern there, and love, and something fierce and protective that made her knees weak. "Thank you," she whispered. "I could not let anything happen to you," Xander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Violet, I know you are not ready. I know I promised to wait as long as it takes, but I need you to know that I love you. I have loved you for 3 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life, whether you ever return that love or not." The words hung between them in the cool afternoon air, and Violet felt something inside her finally break free. All this time she had been waiting for certainty, for some sign that it was acceptable to love again, for permission from a dead man to move forward with her life. But standing here with muddy water soaking her skirt and Xander's hand still on her waist, she realized that certainty never came. Life was uncertain and fragile and could end in an instant, and waiting for the perfect moment meant losing all the imperfect, beautiful moments in between. "Xander," she said, and reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "Ask me." His eyes widened. "Ask you what?" "Ask me to marry you." For a moment he simply stared at her, as if unable to believe what he had heard. Then a smile spread across his face, transforming him, making him almost boyish with joy. "Violet Bailey, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and felt tears of relief and happiness spill down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you." Xander let out a whoop of joy that startled his horse and made several people nearby turn to look. Then he picked Violet up and spun her around, both of them laughing, and when he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was the first kiss since Vernon's death, and Violet had worried that it would feel like betrayal, that guilt would overwhelm her. But instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey. It felt right and real and full of promise. She kissed Xander back with all the pent-up longing and hope she had carried for so long, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The flood receded over the following days, leaving behind mud and debris but relatively little permanent damage. Violet's house had taken on water, and many of her possessions were ruined, but she found she did not care as much as she might have expected. Things could be replaced. What mattered was moving forward. She and Xander were married on a sunny day in late April, in the small church in Raton with most of the town in attendance. Violet wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xander wore a new suit purchased especially for the occasion, and he looked so handsome and happy that Violet felt her heart swell with love. Sheriff Hobbs gave her away, standing in for the father she no longer had, and Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Xander kissed her in front of everyone, Violet felt a sense of peace settle over her that she had not felt in 4 long years. After the wedding, there was a celebration at the church hall with food and music and dancing. Violet danced with Xander, his arm strong around her waist, and she smiled up at him with such joy that several people remarked on how beautiful she looked. "I love you," she told him as they swayed to the music. "I am sorry I made you wait so long." "You were worth waiting for," Xander said, his gray eyes soft with emotion. "I would have waited 10 years if that was what you needed." They spent their wedding night in a hotel in Raton, planning to travel to Denver for a proper honeymoon the following week. Violet had been nervous about the intimacy of marriage after so long alone. But Xander was patient and tender, and the awkwardness melted away in the warmth of their love for each other. When she woke the next morning wrapped in his arms, she felt as though she had been given a second chance at happiness, and she was determined not to waste it. The honeymoon in Denver was wonderful. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in restaurants, attended a performance at the theater, and spent hours simply walking the streets hand in hand, talking and laughing and learning each other in new ways. Violet bought fabric for new dresses, and Xander bought books about cattle ranching, and they both bought gifts to take home to their friends. When they returned to Raton, they moved into a new house that Xander had been arranging to rent without telling Violet. It was larger than her old place, with a proper kitchen and a bedroom with windows that looked toward the mountains. Xander had already moved his few possessions in, and he carried Violet over the threshold with ceremony, both of them laughing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said, setting her down gently in the front room. "Mrs. Quinn," Violet repeated, testing the name. It felt strange and new, but also right. She was no longer Mrs. Bailey, the young widow frozen in grief. She was Mrs. Quinn, a woman with a future and a husband who loved her. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Xander continued his work at the Three Rivers Ranch, and Violet continued her dressmaking business. In the evenings, they would sit together in their front room, Xander reading while Violet sewed, and they would talk about their days and make plans for the future. Xander told her about his dream of owning his own ranch, and Violet encouraged him to pursue it. They began saving money toward that goal, pooling their resources and planning carefully. Xander spoke to the foreman at Three Rivers about the possibility of purchasing some breeding stock, and the foreman, who respected Xander's work, agreed to sell him several heifers and a bull at a good price. 2 years after their marriage, in the spring of 1884, they purchased 200 acres of grazing land north of Raton. It was not a large spread by ranching standards, but it was theirs, and it had good grass and water. They built a small house on the property, nothing fancy but sturdy and well-made, and Xander worked the ranch while also continuing part-time at Three Rivers to ensure they had steady income. Violet had to give up her dressmaking business when they moved to the ranch, as it was too far from town to maintain regular customers. She missed the work and the independence it had given her, but she found new purpose in building a home with Xander and helping him establish their ranch. She learned to help with the cattle when needed, though she would never be as comfortable on horseback as Xander. She kept chickens and a kitchen garden, and she preserved food for the winter months. In August of 1884, Violet realized she was pregnant. She had begun to wonder if she and Xander would be able to have children, as 2 years of marriage had passed without conception. But now, the signs were unmistakable. She told Xander one evening after supper, and his face went through such a rapid succession of expressions, shock to joy to fear to overwhelming happiness, that she laughed despite her own nervousness. "Are you certain?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair and taking both her hands in his. "As certain as I can be," she said. "We should have a baby by next April." Xander pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally released her, she saw tears in his eyes. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Violet assured him. The pregnancy was difficult. Violet was sick for the first several months, and as her belly grew, she found the physical demands of ranch life increasingly challenging. Xander worried over her constantly, trying to make her rest, taking on additional tasks so she would not have to strain herself. In January, when the winter was at its worst, he insisted she go stay in town with Mrs. Henderson until the baby was born. The ranch was too isolated, he argued, too far from the doctor if something went wrong. Violet wanted to stay with him, but she knew he was right. So she reluctantly moved to the Henderson spare room in town, and Xander rode in to visit her every few days, weather permitting. It was lonely being separated from him, especially as the baby's birth approached, but Mrs. Henderson was kind company, and Violet appreciated having another woman nearby. On a cold night in late April 1885, Violet went into labor. Mrs. Henderson sent her husband to fetch the doctor and to ride out to the ranch to tell Xander. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Violet had never known such pain, and there were moments when she feared she would not survive. But Mrs. Henderson held her hand and spoke encouragingly, and the doctor was competent and calm. And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Violet's son was born. Xander arrived an hour later, having ridden through a spring thunderstorm to reach town. He burst into the bedroom where Violet lay exhausted but triumphant, holding their son, and he stopped dead in the doorway, staring at them with an expression of such profound love and awe that Violet felt tears spring to her eyes. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Xander crossed the room slowly, as if walking through a dream. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny red face of his son. Very gently, he reached out and touched the baby's hand, and the infant's fingers closed reflexively around his father's finger. "He is perfect," Xander whispered. "Violet, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Violet asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Violet knew what his name should be. "Vernon," she said quietly. "I would like to name him Vernon, if that is acceptable to you." Xander looked at her with understanding in his eyes. He knew she was honoring her first husband, acknowledging that Vernon would always be a part of her history even as she built a new future. Rather than being threatened by this, Xander seemed touched. "Vernon Quinn," he said, testing the name. "It is a good, strong name. Yes, let us call him Vernon." So Vernon Quinn came into the world, and with him came a new chapter in Violet and Xander's life. They stayed in town for 2 weeks while Violet recovered her strength, and then they returned to the ranch as a family. The little house that had seemed adequate for 2 adults now felt cramped with a baby's cradle and supplies, but they managed. Violet discovered that motherhood suited her. She loved the weight of her son in her arms, the milky smell of him, the way he would gaze up at her with unfocused eyes as he nursed. Xander was besotted with his son, spending every spare moment holding him and talking to him in a soft voice. Watching Xander with Vernon, seeing the gentleness and love in his face, Violet fell in love with her husband all over again. The ranch prospered over the following years. Xander proved to have a good eye for cattle, and their small herd grew through careful breeding and management. They added to their acreage when the opportunity arose, purchasing another 100 acres from a neighbor who was moving back east. Xander hired occasional help during the busy seasons, and gradually the ranch began to turn a real profit. Vernon grew into a lively, curious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 3 years old, Violet gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, and 2 years after that, another son they called Thomas. The house grew more crowded with each addition, and finally, Xander announced that he was going to build them a larger home. Over the course of a year, working in his spare time and with the help of hired carpenters, Xander built a beautiful two-story house with a wide front porch and enough bedrooms for their growing family. The house had glass windows and wood floors, a modern kitchen with a good stove, and a parlor where Violet could entertain visitors. It was the finest house in the area, and Violet felt a surge of pride every time she looked at it, knowing that she and Xander had built all of this together through hard work and dedication. The children thrived on the ranch. Vernon followed his father everywhere, learning the cattle business from the time he could walk. Clara was a bright, determined child who insisted on doing everything her brother did, much to Vernon's chagrin. Thomas was quieter, more thoughtful, with a love of books that reminded Violet of herself. As the years passed, Violet sometimes thought about her first husband and the life they had briefly shared. The grief that had once consumed her had mellowed into a gentle sadness, a sense of loss that no longer defined her but was simply part of her history. She had loved Vernon Bailey with the fierce passion of youth, and his death had nearly destroyed her. But Xander Quinn had taught her that love could come in many forms, that patience and steadiness could be as powerful as passion, and that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the future. In the summer of 1895, 10 years after little Vernon's birth, Violet stood on the porch of their home and watched her children playing in the yard. Vernon was 13 now, nearly as tall as his father, helping Xander mend a fence. Clara, at 7, was trying to climb a tree while Thomas, 5 years old, watched anxiously from below. Violet was 39 years old, and she felt the contentment of a life well lived settling over her like a warm shawl. Xander came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Violet said, leaning back against him. "I am thinking about how patient you were, waiting for me to be ready to love again. I am thinking about how different my life would be if you had given up on me." "I could never have given up on you," Xander said, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "From the first time I really saw you, walking through that snowstorm, I knew you were the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Waiting 3 years for you to reach the same conclusion was nothing compared to spending the rest of my life without you." Violet reached up and touched his face, tracing the scar on his jaw that she had grown to love. "It was not 3 years," she said with a slight smile. "It was 3 years from the time you declared your intentions, but you were watching over me long before that." "True," Xander admitted. "I think I started falling in love with you within months of Vernon's death, though I knew you were not ready to see it. I decided then that I would wait, however long it took." "And you did," Violet said softly. "You waited with such grace and patience. You never made me feel guilty for grieving, never tried to rush me. You just let me know you were there when I was ready." "It was the hardest thing I have ever done," Xander confessed. "There were times I wanted to push, to demand that you see how much I loved you. But I knew that would only drive you away. So I waited and I hoped, and I prayed that someday you would give me a chance." "I am so glad you did," Violet said, and kissed him with all the love and gratitude she felt. After all these years, kissing Xander still made her heart race. She had learned that love was not a finite resource, that loving Xander did not diminish what she had felt for Vernon. Her heart had simply expanded to hold both loves, past and present, and she was richer for it. That evening, after the children were in bed, Violet and Xander sat on their front porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. The sky turned gold and pink and purple, the colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. A cool breeze blew down from the peaks, carrying the scent of pine and sage. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked suddenly. Marrying me, I mean. Do you ever wish you had remained alone, faithful to Vernon's memory? Violet turned to look at him in surprise. In all their years together, he had never asked such a question. Never, she said firmly. Xander, you gave me back my life. When Vernon died, I thought my life was over too. I thought I would simply exist, going through the motions until my own death came. But you showed me that I could live again, truly live, not just survive. You gave me love and family and purpose. How could I ever regret that? I just wanted to be sure, Xander said quietly. Sometimes I see you on the anniversary of his death, and you get this look on your face, so sad and distant, and I wonder if I am enough. Oh, Xander, Violet said, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. She moved closer to him, taking his hand in both of hers. You are more than enough. Yes, I still grieve for Vernon on the anniversary of his death. He was my first love and he died far too young, and I will always carry some sadness about that. But that grief does not take anything away from what I feel for you. I love you completely with my whole heart. You are my husband, my partner, the father of my children. You are everything to me. Xander squeezed her hand and she could see the relief in his eyes. I love you too, he said. More than I can ever adequately express. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars began to emerge overhead. Violet thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the grief and despair of widowhood to the fullness and joy of her life now. It had not been an easy path, and there had been times when she thought she would never find happiness again. But Xander had waited for her, patient as the mountains, and his love had healed her in ways she could never have imagined. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. The ranch grew more successful, and Xander took on additional land and hired full-time help. Vernon, their eldest, proved to have his father's skill with cattle and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 18, he was managing much of the daily operation of the ranch, allowing Xander to step back somewhat from the demanding physical labor. Clara surprised everyone by developing a passion for horses. She learned to ride as well as any cowboy, and she began breeding horses on a corner of the ranch property, producing quality animals that sold for good prices. Thomas, true to his quiet nature, went to college in Denver to study law, though he promised to return to Raton after completing his education. In the summer of 1900, Violet and Xander celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary. They had been married longer than Violet had been widowed, and sometimes it was hard to remember the lonely, grieving woman she had once been. They held a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. There was food and music and dancing, and Violet danced with Xander under the stars just as they had at their wedding reception so many years ago. As she rested her head on Xander's shoulder, moving slowly to the music, Violet reflected on the unexpected paths life could take. If someone had told her, in the terrible grief of those first years after Vernon Bailey's death, that she would one day be this happy again, she would not have believed them. If someone had told her that a patient cowboy would wait 3 years for her to be ready to love again, she would have thought them mad. But Xander had waited, and she had eventually said yes, and together they had built a life far richer than she could have imagined. She had 3 wonderful children, a successful ranch, a home she loved, and a husband who still made her heart flutter when he smiled at her a certain way. She had been given a second chance at happiness, and she had not wasted it. "What are you thinking about?" Xander murmured against her hair. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Violet said. "For you, for our children, for this life we have built together. I am thinking about how close I came to missing all of this because I was too afraid to let go of my grief." "But you did let go," Xander said. You were brave enough to take a chance on loving again, even though you had been hurt so deeply. That took tremendous courage. You made it easy, Violet said. You were so patient, so steady. You never demanded more than I could give, never tried to force me to move faster than I was ready. You just waited, and that made all the difference. The party continued late into the night, and when the last guests had finally departed, Violet and Xander walked hand in hand through their house, blowing out lamps and checking that the children were asleep. Vernon had his own small house now on the property, built the previous year to give him some independence, but Clara and Thomas still lived in the main house. In their bedroom, Xander helped Violet unpin her hair and unbutton her dress, his fingers gentle and familiar after so many years of marriage. They got ready for bed in comfortable silence, and when they finally lay down together, Violet nestled into the curve of Xander's body, his arm draped over her waist. "Thank you for waiting for me," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for saying yes," Xander replied. And Violet fell asleep with a smile on her face, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man she was meant to be with, and that the long wait and the hard journey had been worth it for this perfect, peaceful happiness. The next morning, Violet woke early as was her habit and slipped out of bed without waking Xander. She went downstairs and made coffee, then stepped out onto the front porch to watch the sunrise. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the air was crisp and clean. In the distance, she could see their cattle grazing peacefully, and closer to the house, she could hear the chickens beginning to stir in their coop. This was her life now, so different from the one she had imagined as a young bride married to Vernon Bailey. That life had ended abruptly and tragically, leaving her adrift and broken. But from that brokenness had come healing, and from that healing had come new love and new life. She thought Vernon would have been happy for her, would have wanted her to find love again rather than spending her life alone. At least she hoped he would. Xander came out onto the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He gave one to Violet and stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the peaceful morning. After a moment, Violet leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was thinking about the flood," she said. "Do you remember when the Cimarron overflowed and you pulled me onto your horse?" "I remember," Xander said. "I remember thinking that if the water took you away, my heart would break. I remember the terror of it and the relief when I got you to safety." "That was the day I knew," Violet said. "That was the day I realized I could love you, that I wanted to love you. Standing there with your arms around me, I felt something inside me shift, and I knew I was ready to move forward. And I had been waiting so long for that moment," Xander said with a slight laugh. 3 years of hoping and waiting, and finally you looked at me and saw me, really saw me." "I saw you before that," Violet protested. "I just was not ready to admit what I saw." "I know," Xander said gently, "and I understood, truly I did. Losing someone you love the way you loved Vernon, that kind of grief cannot be rushed. It has to run its course." They stood together on the porch, sipping their coffee and watching the ranch wake up around them. In a few minutes, Vernon would emerge from his house and begin the morning chores. Clara would come downstairs, full of energy and plans for the day. Thomas would wander down later, his nose probably in a book. The daily routine of ranch life would begin, with all its demands and satisfactions. But for now, in this quiet moment before the day began, Violet simply stood with her husband and felt the peace of knowing she was loved and cherished, that she had found her way through grief to joy, and that the patient cowboy who had waited 3 years for her answer had given her a life more wonderful than any she could have dreamed. As the years progressed further, the Quinn Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the region. Xander's reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle spread, and buyers came from as far as Kansas and Texas to purchase his stock. Vernon, the younger, took over more and more of the management, proving himself to be not just a skilled rancher but also an astute businessman. He married a girl from town named Elizabeth, and within a year, Violet and Xander became grandparents. Holding her first grandchild, a baby girl named Sarah after the young woman who had once helped Violet with her dressmaking business, Violet felt a wave of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This tiny life represented the continuation of everything she and Xander had built together, the flowering of the love that had taken so long to bloom. "We have been blessed," she told Xander that evening after Vernon and Elizabeth had taken the baby home to their little house. "So incredibly blessed." "We have," Xander agreed, pulling her close. "And it all started because I was stubborn enough to wait for you. And I was brave enough eventually to say yes," Violet added with a smile. Clara married at 21 to a young rancher from Colorado who shared her passion for horses. They moved to Colorado to start their own ranch, and though Violet missed her daughter, she was happy to see Clara pursuing her dreams. Thomas returned from law school and opened a practice in Raton, becoming one of the most respected attorneys in the territory. He never married, seeming content with his books and his work, though he visited the ranch frequently and was a beloved uncle to his growing collection of nieces and nephews. By 1910, New Mexico was on the verge of statehood, and Raton had grown from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools, churches, and businesses. Violet and Xander, now in their 60s, had stepped back from the day-to-day operation of the ranch, leaving it primarily in Vernon's capable hands. They spent their days in gentle pursuits, raiding, gardening, visiting with grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. One afternoon in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching a thunderstorm approach across the plains, Xander took Violet's hand and said, "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made Violet turn to look at him with concern. "What is it?" "I saw the doctor last week," Xander said slowly. "My heart is not as strong as it used to be. He says I need to take it easy, not do too much physical labor." Fear clutched at Violet's chest. "How serious is it?" "Not immediately dangerous," Xander assured her quickly. "But I am not a young man anymore, and the years of hard work have taken their toll. The doctor says if I am careful, I should have many good years left." Violet felt tears prick her eyes. The thought of losing Xander, of facing widowhood again, was almost unbearable. They had been married for 28 years, and he had become so integral to her life that she could not imagine existing without him. "You have to be careful then," she said fiercely. "You have to do exactly what the doctor says. I cannot lose you, Xander. I cannot." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You are not going to lose me," he promised. "I waited too long for you to leave you now. I plan to be around for many more years, watching our grandchildren grow, annoying you with my presence." Despite her fear, Violet laughed. "You could never annoy me. Give me time," Xander said with a smile. "I am sure I can manage it." True to his word, Xander took better care of himself after the doctor's warning. He let Vernon handle all the heavy work, contenting himself with lighter tasks and advisory roles. And as the months passed without incident, Violet's fear gradually eased, though she never quite lost the awareness that their time together, precious as it was, would not last forever. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1912 with another party at the ranch. Their children and grandchildren gathered, along with friends from across the region. Looking around at all the faces, some familiar from decades past, others young and new, Violet felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. Sheriff Hobbs, now long retired and in his 80s, made the trip from town to attend. He had been one of the first to encourage Xander's courtship of Violet, seeing something in the young cowboy that suggested he would be worthy of the grieving widow. Violet made a point of thanking him. "You were right about him," she told the old sheriff, gesturing to where Xander was playing with a group of grandchildren. "You told me once that I should consider giving him a chance, and I am so glad I eventually listened." "I never told you any such thing," Sheriff Hobbs said with a twinkle in his eye. "I knew you had to come to that conclusion on your own." "Well, whatever guidance you provided, I appreciate it," Violet said warmly. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Violet found a quiet moment alone with Xander. They walked away from the house toward the barn, where they could hear the music and laughter, but be somewhat apart from it. 30 years, Violet said wonderingly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "The best 30 years of my life," Xander said. "Well, 27 if we are being honest. Those 3 years of waiting were somewhat less enjoyable." Violet laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "You said waiting was worth it." "It was," Xander said, suddenly serious. 1,000 times worth it. I would wait 1,000 years for you, Violet." "Let us hope you do not have to," Violet said, and kissed him in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sounds of their family celebrating and the vast New Mexico sky stretching overhead. The following years brought both joy and sorrow, as all years do. They lost Sheriff Hobbs to old age, and then Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife who had been such a support to Violet in her early widowhood. Violet felt these losses keenly, but they were the natural order of things, lives well lived coming to their natural end. More grandchildren were born, and then great-grandchildren, and the ranch continued to prosper under Vernon's management. Clara and her husband did well in Colorado, visiting frequently and bringing news of the wider world. Thomas became a judge, a position of respect and influence that he wore with humility. In 1916, when war broke out in Europe, Violet and Xander watched with concern as young men from the region enlisted to fight. Their grandson, Vernon's eldest son who carried his great-grandfather's name of Vernon Bailey Quinn, enlisted despite his parents' protests. The war seemed very far away from their ranch in New Mexico, but knowing their grandson was in danger made it feel very close indeed. Violet prayed every night for the young man's safe return, and when the war finally ended and Vernon Bailey Quinn came home unharmed, she wept with relief and gratitude. The family held a celebration welcoming him back, and seeing 4 generations of Quinns gathered together, Violet felt the weight of years and the preciousness of family in a way that moved her deeply. Xander's health remained relatively stable through these years, though he grew frailer as he aged. By 1920, when he was 70 years old and Violet was 64, he rarely left the house except to sit on the porch or take short walks around the property. But his mind remained sharp, and he still made Violet laugh with his dry observations and gentle teasing. One evening in early spring of 1921, as they sat together watching the sunset, Xander said quietly, "I think my time is growing short." Violet felt panic clutch her heart. "Do not say such things." "It is not a sad thing," Xander said gently, taking her hand. "I've lived a long life, a good life, and I have been loved by the woman I love more than anything else in the world. Not every man can say that." "I am not ready to lose you," Violet said, her voice breaking. "I know," Xander said, squeezing her hand. "And I am not particularly eager to leave you. But when my time comes, I want you to know that I have no regrets. You gave me everything I ever wanted. You were worth every day of that 3-year wait and worth every day since." Tears streamed down Violet's face. "You saved me," she said. "When Vernon died, I thought my life was over. But you showed me I could live again, could love again. You gave me back myself." "We saved each other," Xander said softly. "I was just a cowboy with dreams before you. You gave me purpose and family and a reason to build something lasting." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge, hands clasped, hearts intertwined after more than 3 decades of marriage. Xander lived for another 2 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1923. Violet woke one morning to find him still and cold beside her, his face peaceful, one hand still reaching toward her as if he had been seeking her even in death. The grief was terrible, as she had known it would be, but it was different from the grief she had felt when Vernon Bailey died. That grief had been violent and shattering, a loss that felt like the end of everything. This grief, though deep and painful, was softer somehow, the sorrow of parting from someone she had shared a lifetime with, knowing that the lifetime had been full and rich and complete. They buried Xander on a hillside on the ranch, in a spot he had chosen years earlier with views of the mountains he had loved. Violet stood at the graveside surrounded by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and friends from across the region. And she thought about the patient cowboy who had waited 3 years for her to be ready to love again. In the months after Xander's death, Violet remained on the ranch, cared for by her children and surrounded by family. She was 77 years old now, her hair white, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her mind remained clear. She spent her days sitting on the porch Xander had built, wrapped in a quilt, watching the ranch activities and playing with the youngest great-grandchildren. She thought often about both men she had loved, Vernon Bailey and Xander Quinn, and about the different ways they had shaped her life. Vernon had been her first love, passionate and intense, cut short by tragedy. Xander had been her second chance, steady and patient, a love that had lasted decades and produced a legacy that would continue for generations. One afternoon, her grandson Vernon Bailey Quinn, the one who had survived the war, came to sit with her on the porch. He was a thoughtful young man, and he had been named for the great-grandfather he had never known. "Grandmother," he said, "will you tell me about my namesake, about Vernon Bailey?" Violet smiled and began to talk, sharing memories she had not spoken of in years. She told him about Vernon's energy and laughter, about their dreams and plans, about the terrible day he was killed. And then she told him about Xander, about the patient cowboy who had waited 3 years for her to be ready to love again, and about the beautiful life they had built together. "So you loved them both?" her grandson asked. "I did," Violet said. "In different ways at different times, but with my whole heart. Vernon's death taught me about loss and grief. Xander's love taught me about healing and second chances. Together, they gave me a life far richer than I could have imagined." Her grandson nodded thoughtfully. "And you are glad you eventually said yes to Grandfather Xander?" "Oh yes," Violet said with certainty. "If I had remained locked in my grief, if I had refused to consider loving again, I would have missed out on 30 wonderful years. I would have missed your father and your aunt and uncle and all of you. I would have spent my life alone, faithful to a memory, and while there would have been a certain tragic nobility in that, it would have been such a waste." "I am glad you said yes too," her grandson said, kissing her weathered cheek. "Otherwise, none of us would be here." Violet lived for 2 more years, dying peacefully in her sleep in the fall of 1925 at the age of 79. Her children buried her beside Xander on the hillside he had chosen, and on her headstone they inscribed her name, her dates, and a simple epitaph. She loved deeply, grieved courageously, and lived fully. The ranch continued for generations after Violet and Xander's deaths, passed down through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of the patient cowboy who waited 3 years for the widow to be ready to love again became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of love and patience and the healing power of second chances. And on the hillside where Violet and Xander lay side by side, wildflowers bloomed every spring, painting the ground with color, while below, the ranch they had built together continued to thrive, a lasting testament to their love and their legacy. The house Xander built, the 2-story home with the wide front porch, still stood decades later, occupied by descendants who knew the stories of their ancestors and honored their memory. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, those who lived there swore they could hear the echo of laughter, the sound of children playing, and the soft murmur of 2 voices talking together as the sun set over the New Mexico plains. It was the sound of a love that had waited 3 years to begin, that had lasted 30 years of marriage, and that had created a legacy that would endure for generations. It was the sound of healing and hope, of grief transformed into joy, of a widow who had been brave enough to love again, and a cowboy who had been patient enough to wait for her answer. And it was the sound of a life well lived together.